Hello, my name is Marisol Rubio. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the San Francisco Bay Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Today I'm located at Coco Cabana in Dublin, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being joined by Council Member Shawn Kumagai, who is running for Assembly District 20. Hello, Shawn. How are you?
Good. Thank you, Marisol, for having me.
Likewise, we're excited to have you join us here today. So we're just going to start with really basic questions, giving the voters a chance to get to know you on a more personal level. Tell us a little bit about your background and what experiences, pivotal experiences in your life brought you to this point and to want to serve in this capacity in public service.
Yeah, thank you. Well, as you said, I'm Dublin Council Member Shawn Kumagai. I started on Dublin City Council in 2018, but really, my whole life has been defined by service. I started off serving in the United States Navy 21 years ago. I did 10 years active duty. I was a trained, what's called cryptologic linguist. I was trained in Chinese Mandarin, and I did surveillance operations for the United States Navy for some years. Then they sent me back to Monterey, California, which is where the Defense Language Institute. And that's where I got involved with training and workforce development. And I really started to segue more into that. As I came off of active duty, I started working as a curriculum developer and as an instructor. And then I decided to go back and get my master's in instructional design. And I was really doing that for about 10 years, doing workforce development for the military and for federal government to make sure that they were able to do their job well. So that's a passion of mine. But then, in 2016, I decided to kind of take a turn and get more into the policy side of service. And I was very involved in issues-oriented organizing here in the Bay Area. And that's when I decided to run for City Council. After I won my seat on City Council and Assemblymember Bauer Kahan won her seat in the Assembly, she asked me to join her team as her district director. So I've been kind of wearing two hats for the past almost 4 years now, working at the local level for the City of Dublin, but also working, doing that community outreach piece for Assemblymember Bauer Kahan for the State Assembly. And I've been very active here in my local community with local service organizations such as Rotary Club and Apapa Tri-Valley chapter. I'm very active within the Democratic Party. I've been a delegate to the state party for a number of years and been working with the Alameda County Central Committee for the past couple of years as well.
Wonderful. Well, first and foremost, thank you for your service. And secondly, you've obviously been very busy, so to say the least. How do you think collectively those experiences have shaped your worldview, specifically in the realm of when you look at public service? What lens do you see it through?
Well, you said it. It's service, right? And for me, it's really about giving back to your community, whether that's your local community or giving back to your country. It's about serving the people that you are tasked with serving. And I think that's part of what informs how I look at things. But really, I feel like my upbringing really informs how I look at service. When my parents got divorced, my mom packed up a U-Haul and we went back to Phoenix, Arizona, where she grew up, because that's where her parents were. And, every day my grandfather would come over and cook us breakfast, often with a bag of groceries. He would pack us lunch and drop us off at school, slip us a little bit of money so that we had a little extra spending money. My mom went back to school. She started basically from nothing, and she went back to school to become a registered nurse. And, it was only through help from her family, but also through a little bit of help through the government that she was able to get on track and make a life for herself and raise two sons as a single mother. And, she had welfare payments, and she had food stamps, and she had federally backed student loans. And it's all of these programs that can really give people a hand up when they need it, so that they can get on track and they can make a better life for themselves and their families. And, my grandfather was an Army veteran. He did a couple years during World War II. My mom ended up, after she got out of college, joining as an Army nurse. And her brother, my uncle, was an Air Force Academy grad. So really, I'm third generation. And when my mother passed away in 2015, I was taking custody of my younger brother. And he came to live with us here in Dublin. And he recently graduated from high school last year, and he went on to join the Army. So it's that kind of legacy of service, but also understanding the government needs to work for people. It needs to give them opportunity, and that's what really kind of defines my politics.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for sharing your personal story. That means a lot. So we're going to dive a little bit into issues. So we'll start out with healthcare. The pandemic revealed that how healthcare disparities can acutely impact us in a sudden crisis. Research has also shown that we spend the most worldwide on healthcare and yet score the lowest on multiple quality of care metrics. Doing nothing, obviously, is not an option. And some would argue that continuing to build on the current structure will only lead to more costs and healthcare disparities. What can be done to close the gap in access to quality, affordable, and timely health care? And do you believe universal health care is a viable option? If so, how can we make that happen?
Absolutely, universal health care is a viable option, and it's something we have to do. I think we are, I look at things in terms of how we are spending money and how efficiently it's being done. And it's very obvious right now that we do not have an efficient system that's working for all people. So I don't know exactly what that's going to look like in the future, but it's very obvious that the system is broken and we have a system of haves and have-nots, and that's just not sustainable. But I'm very proud of the work that California has done over the past several years to apply budget surpluses to expand access to full scope Medi-Cal for more people. Whether that's lowering the age for seniors to have access to that resource, or opening it up to young adults, or opening it up to undocumented immigrants. At the end of the day, everyone should have access to health care. Now, I think that's indisputable. I mean, I guess some people would argue against that, but I think that's a pretty obvious thing. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure that healthcare is focused on quality outcomes for patients. And what we have is, a lot of times, we have coverage that's simply not adequate and that does not center patient welfare and healthcare outcomes in the way that it's structured. So I think no matter what, when going forward, we need to make sure that we're thinking about better patient outcomes. And we need to tackle big systemic questions like whether or not a fee-for-service model is really working in this country, and whether or not we need to come up with some more values-based approach to really get patients the preventative care that they need so that they can avoid disease and other outcomes that are not good.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, quality is one component, but access is also another, and timeliness is another issue, especially for patients who are on Medi-Cal. The wait period is very long, especially for specialty care. What are your ideas on how we can address that for those who are actually experiencing those hardships right now?
Yeah, I mean, certainly Medi-Cal is not a perfect system, and I think that we need to learn from that and kind of look at what the best practices are for improving that overall system. When we talk about something like CalCare, what exactly would something like that look like? We don't want everyone to be in kind of the existing Medi-Cal system, because that's just not really built for that, and obviously it's not a sustainable model, because a lot of our healthcare systems are supplementing what they're getting from Medi-Cal, or even Medicare for that matter, with other premium-based healthcare insurance plans that are provided by employers. So we need some kind of blend of those two systems. I mean, you're absolutely right. It really, we should be focused on how to improve that quality of care and access to that care right now. We're reaching pretty close to 100% coverage here in California, which is great, but it's still inadequate.
And the timeliness is perhaps for Medi-Cal patients in particular is the biggest problem. The other thing I was wondering, we talk about the silver wave that is inevitably coming, and how are we going to deal with, obviously, the fact that private insurance is limited in terms of providing long-term care, nursing care, and those who qualify for government-based nursing home care also have very strict restrictions. What are some solutions you might suggest?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing some serious issues, even with private plans where people have paid into long-term care plans. And because the estimates that were set up were not 100% accurate, costs have outpaced what they expected, and people are living longer. And also, I think the need for long-term care is much greater than they ever anticipated. So we have an under-resourced system currently. I don't know what the full solution is, but what I will say is one piece of that I really want to dig into is the issue around creating capacity. We really need to invest more as a state into the care economy. Making sure that people have pathways into these jobs and that we're incentivizing people to get in these jobs. Because these are tough jobs, and oftentimes they're not the best paid, right? So how do we identify those people? How do we better fund those systems? But really getting them, the right people, into those career paths so that they can get into care economy jobs. So it's a multifaceted problem that we're really going to have to continue to look at, but I think it starts with big investments from the state in the care economy workforce.
Absolutely, and it is a big undertaking, so I appreciate you taking the time to explain some of that. And the other, obviously, we've seen that it's much more efficient and less costly for people to be caring for their family members in home than having nursing care. So obviously fortifying our funds for those types of services is part of the solution. Thank you so much. So we're going to shift to reimagining public safety. According to an article by Cal Matters in July 2019, Black people comprise about 7% of California's population, but account for 15% of police killings. Latinos comprise 39% of California's population, but account for 46% of police killings. These figures are even more staggering if you look at the number of unarmed people who are killed. About 20.38% of police killings involve unarmed people. So we clearly, and I should add, meanwhile, according to the CSNBC in June 2020, despite a sharp decline in crime rates since the early 1990s, we're spending more on policing than ever. So what are some of the ideas you have to create a safer, more cooperative relationship between law enforcement and community?
Well, I think, fundamentally, as I'm out and about in this district, one of the core issues is that we have severely underinvested in some of these communities for decades, right? And so that has led to more crime. It has strangled access to opportunity for folks, whether that's pathways through education or into good paying jobs. We even are under-resourced in terms of recreation facilities and access to free or low-cost programs so that people can have other things to do with their time, So I think that is kind of the fundamental issue, is that we need to start investing more in these types of programs and facilities. But we do have an issue. I think it was really brought to light or brought to our consciousness during 2019 with George Floyd and so many others who were on our screens, and we were just like, enough. It's time for us to actually have a conversation and start doing something about this. I'm very proud as a council member that we undertook a diversity, equity, and inclusion task force process. We impaneled a diverse group of community leaders to engage around the issue of policing here in Dublin, but also how we as a city create opportunity for participation in all of our activities for our diverse community. But here in California, I'm really glad that we have undertaken some major policing reforms. We have one of the most strict use of force definitions in the country, and we absolutely should. There have been measures to decertify bad actors, right? When law enforcement, when there is a police officer who is repeatedly using force when they perhaps shouldn't be, then there needs to be a way so that they can never have a badge again. And I think, I look at this kind of as a veteran, when I served in the military, and, I'll say in the military we had a serious issue with sexual assault. And we were trying every which way to tackle that issue. At the end of the day, us service members who are doing the right thing, treating people with dignity, we don't want our good reputation to be soiled by these bad actors, right? But what it came down to is we had an internal review process that, it's just hard when you have that culture of protect your own and, you have each other's backs. It's hard to think that someone within your own ranks is going to betray your trust and go against all the training that you've received and do something so heinous. And I think that we see the same thing in a lot of law enforcement agencies, right? They want to trust their fellow police officer and they want to give them the benefit of the doubt. So it's very obvious that a strict internal review process is not sufficient. And that's what we did in the military. We said, okay, we're taking it out of the hands of the commanding officer to investigate. We need to have an independent investigator to look at these situations. And it's starting to work. It's working because you have someone who's not biased look at that. Speaking of bias, I think that's a serious issue that we have in law enforcement. And, we need to continue to address that and recognize that law enforcement are trained to look at communities of color in a slightly different way. So how do we break that cycle? And how do we put in place systemic change to get back on the path of community policing? Here in Dublin, it's a very safe community, and I'm proud of that. And, knock on wood, in my tenure on city council, we haven't had police-involved use of force. And we've had a couple close calls, and I'm very proud of our officers for using good judgment in a very tense situation, practicing restraint, using their de-escalation techniques. So that, I think, it's a real model for what I want to see happen more throughout agencies across the state.
Absolutely. And so what are some of your ideas in terms of how, one, for example, the relationship of law enforcement within our community? For example, the presence of, should police officers be present in, armed police officers be present in schools? What's the role of law enforcement, say, with small businesses, especially with the snatch and grab issues? That has really rattled a lot of business owners, especially small business owners who have don't have as many buffers in these kinds of situations should it happen to them. What ideas do you have about that?
Yeah, it's a real problem. While we absolutely must continue to do the good work of policing reform and criminal justice reform, our communities also expect to be safe, and some of our least resource communities are often the ones that are most affected by property theft crimes, but also violent crimes. And we need to recognize that we still have a lot of work to do to ensure that those things don't happen. Now, I'm a big fan of technology-enabled solutions. I think it can be a force multiplier. And there are certainly privacy right issues that need to be discussed in open to talk about how some of these things might be used to target certain communities or There might be inherent bias built into those systems that we need to address. But for example, here in Dublin, we have situational awareness cameras. We have automatic license plate readers. That allows police officers often to respond perhaps to someone who already has a warrant out for their arrest before they commit another crime. And when they're investigating those crimes, they have an additional resource to go back and look and say, oh, here's the person driving away from that smash and grab or that robbery. So now we have a lead about where we can perhaps find that person. But a lot of these things that we're seeing are crimes of poverty, and I think we need to understand that as well, right? It's not going to be just about grabbing people who steal a package of diapers and throwing them in jail, right? We need to have the right kind of diversion programs, anti-recidivism programs, but get people back onto pathways of being productive and for caring for themselves and their families. And oftentimes we don't do that. Sometimes people come out of prison and it's just like, okay, good luck, they go, and then they go back into the same environment that really nurtured them to that point in their life, and they fall back into the same bad habits, right? So how do we break that cycle? And there's no doubt about it. We're incarcerating too much, and that is not an efficient way for us as a society to address most of these problems. By all means, if someone is a direct threat to their community, or to individuals, yes, we do need to find a way to ensure that they are taken out of the community until we can, get them back on the right path and get them corrected, if that's even possible. But for everyone else, I think I do believe there is a pathway back to them getting back into society.
Right. It's differentiating, say, crimes that are a result of sociological issues that led them down that pathway versus crimes that obviously are violent crimes and have deeper, more profound consequences.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So moving on to, we're going to move on to education a little bit. So California continues to rank 37th in K through 12 education, and while it ranks 4th in higher education, clearly there's a stark difference in our performance between K through 12 versus higher education. What can the state legislature do to ensure that all children, high need, ESL, and children with disabilities are getting a quality education from pre-K through 12?
Absolutely more funding. At a fundamental level, we need to raise the base funding levels so that all schools are being uplifted. I support the local control funding formula and what it aims to do. We certainly need to make sure that more resources are going to the areas of most need. But it's embarrassing that we're 37th in the country. A state as great as this with such a great economy, we really need to be investing more. And I believe that education is an investment. And it's an investment to additional opportunity, but it's also an investment into our economy. When we have a great education system, and we see that a lot with our public higher ed system, right? It's a feeder into our world-class industries, into innovation, into so much more. So it's important that we continue to think of that as not as an expense, but as an investment in our future, the future of our state. Now, I think there's a lot of things that we can do better. Like I mentioned at the head, I'm an instructional designer, so I think a lot about vocational training and workforce development and these kind of things. And if we want to move people into care economy jobs, into 21st century jobs in coding or cybersecurity, or into building trades, where we have a lot of people. We have a lot of construction that needs to get done, from infrastructure to housing, and we don't have enough workers to make that happen. So, I really want to use my expertise and focus there. I think we are underutilizing our K through 16 public education system when it comes to these kind of vocational training programs. And it really should be seamless, right? You should be able to get the underlying fundamental skills that you need to get into a vocational training program in high school. And a lot of it is about exposure in high school. You know, we have this sometimes one-sided thought that everyone needs to go to a 4-year college into a degree-bearing program right away. I didn't do that. My younger brother didn't do that. You know, there's a lot of different pathways into good careers. And sure, you know, if you want to move on into management, you might go and get a 4-year degree or master's down the road. But that's not for everyone. And I think we need to start thinking about how we move people into the right kind of jobs, these critically understaffed jobs that we're really going to need in the 21st century.
Absolutely. And so when you, for example, speaking of funding and the local control funding formula, what are some ways to increase funding with underneath the local control funding formula?
Well, I was a big proponent of Prop 15, you know, that would have created a split roll on our property tax that was put in place under Prop 13, right? It was dubbed the Schools and Communities First initiative. It did not quite make it through, but I think we need to continue to have that conversation. You know, part of the problem is that our property taxation system is a little bit lopsided right now. You know, when Prop 13 was put in place, commercial property owners were paying nearly 2/3 of property tax, and now it's inverse. Now they're only paying about 1/3, right? So that's a problem that we need to rectify, and we're seeing a lot of kind of a boom in general fund revenues in the state of California that is driven by income tax. But as we go into the next recession, a lot of that's going to dry up. And then we're going to have to make some really tough decisions. The way to counterbalance that is by having a good balanced property taxation system to make sure that you have a steady stream of revenue, to make sure that those are paying for things like schools when we need it. So we're going to have those tough conversations about what taxation looks like in this state going forward and how we can make sure that it's sustainable.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for your thoughtful response. So, looking at higher education, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics, the consumer price index for college tuition and fees increased by 63% over 10 years, while the cost of all other items increased by just 21%. In light of these statistical observations, how can we make higher education more affordable and accessible, especially for low-income and non-traditional students, such as single parents or students with disabilities? Not every student can get a scholarship, and sometimes those scholarships have demands attached to it that have requirements that people who are marginalized populations find very challenging to meet for socioeconomic reasons.
Yeah, some of the metrics by which we judge our financial aid system are inherently inequitable. So I think we need to take a look at that and see where we can open up access to some of those programs. You know, it's tough. I think part of the problem too, part of the kind of inflation in higher ed costs is around cost of living too. And we see that starkly here in the Bay Area, right, where there are rising costs of hiring talent to teach in our world-class higher ed system, and that is largely being driven by cost of living, right? So obviously it's going to be more expensive to run a school. So we have to do more to bring the cost of living down here in California, particularly here in the Bay Area. You know, and cost of living is not even really taken into account at all for students when they're qualifying for financial aid, right? So, I mean, someone who's making the same amount of money in, say, the Central Valley is judged at the same level as someone who is making that same amount of money here in the Bay Area, when we know that people in the Bay Area, that money doesn't go as far. So they're much more likely to be in poverty or housing overburdened at that same income level. So these are the kind of conversations we need to have. And, you know, I think I'm proud of the community college system we have here in California, and we really need to make sure that that is sustained and offered as a viable option for more people. You know, here in our district, Chabot Las Positas Community College District, they are a great feeder school right here locally into Cal State East Bay, and to the other UC and CSU system schools. So they're doing something really great, and I think that's a model for us to look at. Chabot College has a lot of great programs to ensure access to traditionally underserved communities, including communities of color, including previously incarcerated individuals. So it's those kinds of, I think, innovative and thoughtful approaches which can help to break down those barriers and allow people entry into the higher ed system.
Absolutely, thank you. So speaking of the environment, getting to zero emissions by 2030 will require a great deal of infrastructure investment. What are your proposals for transitioning from fossil fuels to clean, renewable energy? Thinking along the lines of consider all the stakeholders. How do we bring everybody to the table and make this happen in a timely manner?
Well, first and foremost, I think we need to look at this through an equity lens. We need to ensure that as we transition into a 100% renewable future, that we have a just transition, right? I mean, we need to think about the folks who are in energy sector jobs and how they transition into green energy sector jobs. You know, one example is that we have folks working locally in refineries, and you know, we're probably not going to see 100% reduction in use of fossil fuels anytime soon. What we need to do is we need to make sure that those folks who are in those jobs are transitioning gradually over into things like biodiesel, because biodiesel is better than fossil fuel diesel. Or moving them into products such as green hydrogen, or moving them into jobs where we are sequestering carbon out of our various processes in our energy economy and burying that underground. You know, I was very heartened when I read Lawrence Livermore National Lab. They put out a study last year around carbon, around going net negative in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And, you know, a lot of the technology is there, and a lot of the technology is coming. So, you know, we have the solutions at our disposal as long as we're willing to invest. And it's no longer sufficient for us just to go net neutral on our greenhouse gas emissions. If California is going to really turn back the tide on climate change, we're going to have to go negative, and we're going to have to start pulling those greenhouse gas emissions out of the atmosphere and really showing leadership in those areas. I'm really excited about everything that our community choice aggregators, our CCAs, are doing in terms of pushing local renewable projects. But as we move towards 100% electrification and as we move to 100% renewable energy, we're going to also need to think about how do we store that energy for later use, right? Our system is not set up for a 100% renewable grid. We need what's called seasonal energy storage too, right? As the winds die down, as the sun is not out as much, you know, and we're not generating as much energy, how do we move energy, latent energy, back into the system that has been stored in the long term, not just battery backup, but in long-term kinetic storage. So these are all going to be very big infrastructure projects, but the good news is they're going to create great, good-paying jobs in the trades, and I think that is going to be a win-win for us here in the Bay Area.
Absolutely, absolutely, and thank you for that. In terms of environmental justice issues, you know, there's this recent study that showed that non-Hispanic whites breathe in about 17% less air pollution than they cause by their own consumption, while Black and Hispanic people inhale more than 50% more pollution than generated by their own actions. What initiatives will you take to ensure that there is environmental justice?
Well, a lot of it has to do with long-term patterns of development and where we have put some of these, polluting infrastructure embedded them into communities of color. So that is a problem. I'm excited that we're starting to talk about environmental impacts in more of an equitable way. So there's a move in the legislature to tie mitigations to development to the communities that it's impacting. So, like, for example, if you're developing something that emits a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, like a warehouse or something like that, right? Typically, you would be expected to mitigate that as much as possible and perhaps do some things to lessen the amount of air pollution. Well, currently, you don't have to do it in the community that is being affected. You could perhaps do some mitigation elsewhere in the state or elsewhere in the Bay Area, and that's inherently inequitable, right? So starting to look at, like, okay, if we're going to create this impact, how do we lessen the impact in the community that we're affecting? So I think I'm excited about that conversation. But a lot of it too is transportation pollution. This district has tons of interstate highways on it, and a lot of truck traffic coming over from the Central Valley back and forth to the Port of Oakland, right? And that traffic is cutting directly through many of these communities that are communities of color. So it's important that we really start investing in and taking serious modernizing our transportation system so that we have electric semi-trucks and the infrastructure to support it, so that we have more rail transportation that is green, battery or green hydrogen powered, so that more people can get out of their cars, and also expanding zero emission vehicle infrastructure, whether that's hydrogen or charging stations. I live in an apartment complex that is older, and there are no charging stations there, right? So how do people who live in those kind of settings, let alone people who are in disadvantaged communities, how do they have access to the same kind of clean energy and clean transportation options? So, the last thing I'll say is that buses are going to be part of that solution too. And I'm really proud that we were able to keep here in the Bay Area a Gillig plant, right? The Gillig plant is creating buses for clients all over the country, especially here in the Bay Area. And they are on the cutting edge of creating zero emission buses. So I'm excited that we're able to do that here locally. That creates good paying jobs, and it also is creating a real benefit for our communities.
Thank you. So we have a housing crisis, obviously, in California, and homelessness issue that requires our attention. According to the San Francisco Chronicle, just last week, Alameda County saw a significant jump in the number of people experiencing homelessness in 2022, compared with the number recorded in 2019. According to preliminary point-in-time data, a federally mandated tally used to make funding and programming decisions related to homelessness, but the increase wasn't proportionate across the different cities in the county. While Oakland still has the highest number of people experiencing homelessness, some of the largest increase in that population since 2019 were observed in the more suburban parts of the county like Union City, Dublin, and Fremont. Those suburban communities had relatively fewer people experiencing homelessness in prior years, especially compared with bigger cities like Oakland and Berkeley. Union City, wedged between Hayward and Fremont, recorded 106 homeless people total in 2019, but that figure ballooned to more than 4 times to 489 in 2022. What will you do as Assembly member in 8020 to address this crisis more effectively? What specific ideas, programs, or policies do you have in mind?
Well, homelessness is a multifaceted issue, but let me start off by saying it was shocking to see the percentage increase in areas of South County and East County. I have asked staff to take a look at, you know, maybe if there are any differences in the way that the data was collected. You know, even in previous years when we saw our point in time capture, these are just samplings, and then they use a formula to extrapolate how many unhoused individuals you might have in your jurisdiction. I always felt that our numbers were too low. I always thought, well, sometimes there is the homelessness that you can see out in the street, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are people living in their cars. There are people who are couch surfing. There are people who might experience intermittent periods of homelessness. It was shocking to see how many of our community college students are struggling with housing stability. Right, so I think this is a much bigger problem than even those point in time reports really show. I largely view homelessness as an economic issue. You know, we have so many people who are housing overburdened here in the Bay Area, and they are just one catastrophe away from being homeless. You know, they might just be one paycheck away from being out on the street, right? So what we have found is that if you can intervene at that moment and prevent someone from entering homelessness, they are 8 times more likely to rebound than someone who enters into homelessness. And the biggest concern, too, is that once they enter into homelessness, they enter into a downward cycle, spiral of trauma, right? Because it's really traumatizing to lose the comfort and safety of a home and to be out in the streets or trying to figure out, you know, where you're going to sleep tonight or you know, how are you going to get back into a home. That can lead to mental health issues. That can lead to substance use disorder issues. And then you start to spiral downwards and it becomes harder and harder to get out. What we saw during the pandemic was that if people can get housed, if we can just put a roof over their head, it's so much easier for us to start to get them the services that they need to get back on the right track. We saw some programs in your county, in Contra Costa County, they were seeing upwards of 50% success rate in exiting people from temporary housing, temporary shelter, into permanent supportive housing. And that's incredible, right? If we could cut the number of unhoused individuals on the streets by half, just by putting them in a home, then we will have done a great job in tackling this issue. Now, I said at the head, homelessness is a multifaceted issue. We also have decades of severe underinvestment in mental health care and in substance use disorder care. And those two things are often interlinked, right? We need to create more capacity. That's why, as District Director for Assemblymember Bauer Cahan, I've been very proud to work alongside her on a bill called AB 988. And what that does is it proposes to create a funding mechanism so we can have a well-funded mental health crisis response system so that when people call 988 instead of 911, they can get in touch with some operator who can help triage the situation and determine whether or not you need some kind of mental health care response. We have for far too long treated mental health care as a criminal response. And that is not the right way to approach it, you know. And I don't think when I talk to police officers, that's not the work they want to be doing. You know, they want to be keeping our communities safe. They want to be fighting crime. They don't want to be caseworkers. They don't want to be mental health professionals. That really should be done by someone else. And we need to make sure that there's a continuum of care, so that people can get into care and they can get a warm handoff into the services that they need. But that's going to require that we create capacity, and that's why AB 988 is such a good proposal, because it adds a small fee onto everyone's phone bill, just like we pay for 911, and that fee is going to go towards funding this mental health crisis response system statewide. And that's going to create more social workers, more therapists, more counselors, more psychologists, more psychiatrists. And that's what we need to do, because we don't even have enough people for the demand that we have right now. So we really need to start putting more money into that system.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, moving on to small business owners, as you know, took a hard hit during
Yes.
the pandemic. What are some of the ideas or solutions you have for helping them recover after 2 years of essentially experiencing severe losses?
Well, first and foremost, I believe that as elected officials, we need to listen. I need to listen to our small business community and hear how dynamic situations and the policy that we're affecting is ultimately affecting their businesses. I'm very proud to have the support of organizations like the Pleasanton Chamber of Commerce and the California Chamber. Not that I agree with them all the time on every issue, but because I have a track record of sitting down and listening to their concerns and taking that into consideration. And ultimately, I think that's what it's about. You know, during the pandemic, we listened and we heard that one of the gaps that a lot of people were experiencing was there was no commercial rent relief for small businesses. You know, there was residential rent relief, there was PPP, there was EIDL loans. There were all these different things, but if you were behind, if you were in arrears on your rent as a small business, there was nothing for you, right? So all we could say is, well, maybe, go take a loan out. Well, who's going to take a loan out when you don't know when you're going to be able to reopen your business? Who's going to give you that loan, right? I mean, so they were really between a rock and a hard place. So what we did in Dublin is we used some of our ARPA money. That's the American Rescue Plan Act money that came down. We used $1 million to do commercial rent relief. And we were able to get that out quickly to our small businesses, particularly our restaurants here, like Coco Cabana, could avail themselves of that if they were behind on their rent. And that was a big help. Now, we didn't save every single business, but I think that it helped a lot of people to, as the economy opened back up, for them to get back on their feet. The other thing is any point in time, you're going to see changes in the dynamics and the economy. And small businesses are always kind of trying to adjust and pivot to those changes. During the pandemic, we were seeing a lot of delivery services pop up, right? And those delivery services were passing the buck along to the restaurants and small businesses. And they were saying, hey, we're going to charge you XYZ. And they were in a position where they couldn't really negotiate that. They were dependent on those delivery services so they could still bring some revenue in. So we as a city looked at that and we said, okay, no, we want to cap delivery services fees so that it's not disproportionately impacting our restaurants. And they're going to have to find some other way to make that up, and they said that was a huge help. That was a huge help to their bottom lines. So these are the kind of solutions. I think it's partially regulation. But the number one thing I'm hearing right now at this point in time is the hiring crisis. It's really hard for people to find work. And it is inextricably linked to the affordability crisis here in the Bay Area. Businesses cannot attract workers because workers can't live in the community, and they're just not willing to commute an hour in for a service job in many cases, right? So we need to do more to make it more affordable, particularly here in the Bay Area. And that means we've got to create more housing across the spectrum. We need to create more subsidized affordable housing, but just housing in general so that more people can live in the communities that they work and work in the communities that they live. And guess what? That's good for the environment too, right? When you can live locally, then you don't have to do those long commutes and emit all those greenhouse gas emissions going back and forth from your home. But people, at the end of the day, they also want quality time with their families. They don't want to be sitting 2 hours a day in their car going back and forth to work. They'd rather be going to soccer matches with their kids and helping them with their homework and being at family dinner. and that's a quality of life issue as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, and tangentially, I know Dublin's done a great job with having some housing right next to public transportation, which helps in when there's no other alternative but needing to commute and helps reduce the use of cars.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very proud of the work that we've done in Dublin. Now, not every community is going to look like Dublin. Dublin has a very special case because we annexed a lot of county land 20 some years ago, and we've been executing a build out plan. We're sitting in an area that used to be a ranch. There was nothing here. This was an open field before. And now look, it's a thriving community. Behind here is a apartment building that we acquired through a middle income housing program here in Dublin. And it's built into this beautiful commercial space, and right across the street from some medical offices and other commercial offices. So this is what we need to start thinking about when we think about our urban planning, right? How do we create real mixed use neighborhoods so that people can work, shop, and live in close proximity, and yes, also have access to quality transportation or mass transit like our BART stations here.
Right, absolutely. So speaking, kind of going back to what's underlying all of this as well, is wages. According to the United Ways of California, in July 2021, a study called Struggling to Move Up, the Real Cost Measure in California 2021, found that the share of families that struggle financially is 250% higher in California than what is factored in the federal government's measure. It amounts to 3.5 million families who are unable to meet basic needs, a situation affecting Hispanic, Latinx, and Black households at much higher rates than other communities. Some of the primary findings were nearly 1 in 3 California households, as mentioned earlier, 3.5 million families, which is 32%, do not earn sufficient income to meet basic needs. Households of all races struggle, but the challenges are greatest, as mentioned, to Hispanic and Black families. Over 1.7 million Hispanic Latinx households, 51% of all families are estimated to not earn enough to get by, compared to 1.06 million white households, which is 20%. What are some of your, what can we do to make sure that the wealth and income gap do not continue to grow? And do you support the fight for 20? Why or why not?
Absolutely. We need to continue to push for higher minimum wages. I also want to be mindful of how that impacts our small businesses. We did carve-outs in our previous measures to kind of make sure that those impacts were a little slower on small businesses. But look, you can go out and work at a fast food restaurant right now for $20 an hour because, one, inflation is happening at a breakneck speed, but also like we were talking about before, there's just not enough workers, right? And everyone is trying to attract workers so that they can keep their businesses open. So I think that when we raise wages, it ends up being an economic multiplier in our communities, right? Because people who are wage earners tend to spend a larger proportion of their money in their local economies, right? They spend it on groceries and shopping and eating out instead of, putting it into other, long-term savings plans, right? Not that that's not a good thing too. I mean, everyone should be able to do that as well. But I think we need to be mindful about what role the government has in that and how we implement that so that it isn't stifling to our business community. And I will go back again to housing affordability because we do see just a larger proportion, especially in this area, of people who are housing overburdened. And that is money that just goes away. That's money that could be spent on other things that people need. That's money that could be spent on healthcare. That's money that could be spent on education for their families. So we really need to work more to build more housing, to create more subsidized affordable housing so that people have that disposable income.
Right. And as you know, I mean, a lot of the, especially as you saw, the Hispanic Latinx, and was 51% of all families and 41% for Black households. Many of these communities of colors are really the driving force behind these restaurants and small businesses, and are not making ends meet. And so, the not continuing to provide a living wage doesn't seem very viable. So, what can we do to enable small businesses and in restaurants such as these to be able to afford and provide a living wage?
Well, I think this is a very good inflection point in our economy because these businesses are realizing that in a tight labor market that they need to have ways to attract workers, and that means a generous compensation plan, right? Because they're competing with other folks who are trying to hire. So they're already looking at ways that they can attract more workers. What we can do is make sure that we are protecting our small businesses to the greatest extent possible from additional regulation so that they don't bear costs. What we often don't think about at the California state level is that, I mean, regulation is necessary, and it's often done with good intent. But a lot of times, big companies can absorb the cost of that regulation much easier than a small business can, right? So when we think about these different types of regulation, we need to think about small business carve-outs. We need to think about structuring it in a different way so that it doesn't disproportionately impact small businesses. If we just only tackle wages and raise them, it's really going to have a disproportionate impact on small businesses. And small businesses are the driving force in our economy, and often they are the entry into wealth for communities of color and for women and for minorities. So we don't want to make it so that people can't have that entry into opportunity through having their own small business. So I think we just need to be really mindful of that and really careful when we enact policy.
Absolutely. So looking at it from a larger, kind of stepping back a little bit, looking at everything that's happening worldwide, really, even in the war in Ukraine, unfortunately, and how those macroeconomics situations how do you think that might be impacting us locally here? And what might that predict about our economic forecast, especially as we see the cost of living, gas, and other commodities, essential commodities, going up in costs?
Yeah, I mean, we went through a long, protracted period of globalization, and now we're starting to see some of the cons of that model, right? And not to say we're ever going to roll all the way back and not be a globalized economy. That ship has sailed. I mean, we are a globalized economy, and it has its benefits. However, I think what we're seeing with the war in Ukraine is that there are all of these linkages within our economy that have unintended consequences, right? For example, many people knew, I didn't know, that, Ukraine and Russia, that area there, creates a lot of the world's wheat, and it creates a lot of the world's fertilizer, right? So that has a very big linkage into our food economy, right? And so now we're going to start seeing the impacts of that over the coming months and that shortage. We've already been seeing the impacts of supply chain issues, whether it's the lack of microchips for our cars or our computers or other equipment that we depend on here in the United States, or it's just a lack of basic resources like paper. Who knew we were going to have these intermittent paper shortages, right? So I think we need to start thinking about how we bring back some of that capability into our state. And like I mentioned earlier about the Gillig plant, right? I mean, that could have gone to China. It could have gone to another state, but we kept it here locally. We made that investment, and it's going to pay dividends. And if we can bring more of those types of light manufacturing and heavy manufacturing kind of industries back into California so that we can be a little bit more self-sufficient, then I think that's a good thing. So we need to start thinking about how we incentivize that.
Thank you. Sounds good. So what are your top, okay, if you had to list your top 3 bills on your insight right now, what do you think are the top 3 bills, most important bills going through the state legislature right now? And what will be your top 3 issues that you will tackle in your first year as Assembly member?
Well, I already mentioned AB 988. I'm hoping that Assemblymember Bauer-Cahan will move that through this year. It may, who knows what the final version is going to look like. You know, all of these pieces of legislation are constant works in progress, right? So I hope to join her in that work to continue to provide a steady stream of funding for mental health care capacity. So that would be one. The other, I'm very excited about AB 2011. It's a Buffy Wicks bill. It's a housing bill that creates incentives for utilizing underutilized commercial spaces in urban development for housing. And it creates a streamlined process. But what's brilliant about the bill is that it also includes a prevailing wage and a requirement for medical benefits and other benefits for the workers. So we're both raising the standard for construction work in terms of the benefits package, but we're also creating an incentive to do what I think is just smart development, right? We want to start utilizing some of this commercial space that's just not really getting used for what it's intended for and put it to good use in creating housing. I'm also want to see us really tackle CEQA reform. So CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, is a bill with, I believe, good intentions. You know, it's designed to give people a voice in the development process to make sure that we do our due diligence in identifying the environmental impacts of development and mitigate to the greatest extent possible those impacts. We talked about it earlier, right, with communities of color where they might have development that's impacting their air quality, and they deserve to have that mitigated in their communities so that they're not paying the price for that development in poor health outcomes because of worsened air quality. Now that being said, when we look at CEQA, we see that it's being used for things that I think don't meet that intended mission of that legislation. You know, we're seeing that upwards of 50% of CEQA challenges are for infill housing development. A big chunk of the rest of that is being used against public works projects, right? So these are things that we need to find a way to streamline and approve and get built. We need more housing, infill housing, so that we can combat sprawl and do things in a smarter way that's better for the climate. We need more public works projects to provide for our transportation infrastructure, water infrastructure, grid infrastructure, right? And you know, for example, utility scale solar. We're going to need more of that. And if CEQA is getting in the way, then it just seems kind of counterproductive. So I think we're at a point now where we're at a critical mass. You know, what we just saw at UC Berkeley after years of back and forth around their environmental impact reports for increased student housing and increasing enrollments, it was obvious that CEQA was getting in the way and preventing access to opportunity. And that's the balance that we need to strike. We need to make sure that it's not preventing access to opportunity, and it's really being done in a way that is focused on climate action. So I want to get in there and really focus on that work and many other things.
CEQA being one of the first, I assume. So what, you know, why are you our voters' best choice? What specifically do you feel is you're providing distinctly?
Well, I wouldn't have gotten in the race if I didn't think I brought the most to the table to get results for the people of this district. I believe that a record of results matters, and I'm the only elected official in this race, and people have a record to look at. They can like it or they could not like it, but they have something to judge me by. I'm pretty proud of my record of getting results for the people of the East Bay, and I believe that my resume shows that I have worked broadly at the federal, state, and local level to serve our communities and to affect meaningful policy change. And, I think that will resonate with voters, but we'll see. We'll see what people think on June 7th.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, Shawn. But before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance to let voters know how they can learn more about you and where they can go to perhaps reach out to you if they have any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Marisol, for this great conversation. And thank you to all of you out there who are watching this. Please visit ShawnKumagai.com, and you can learn more about my background and about my campaign, and you can sign up to help out, or you can donate there. I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, so please follow me there. And on my website, there's a way to sign up for our newsletter, our e-newsletter, so please do that so you receive our email communications. Please vote by June 7th. We're unfortunately anticipating a low turnout primary this year, which is always, sad, it's particularly when our communities of color don't turn out. So we're really trying to engage as best we can with the various communities. And this is a majority-minority district, right? And it's a plurality Asian Pacific Islander district. I'm the only Asian American in the race, and I'm very proud of our efforts to reach out to the diverse Asian Pacific Islander community. But yes, please vote. Whoever you vote for, just vote. It's so important.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shawn, for joining us. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you and learning more about your campaign and your platform.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for doing this.
Likewise, thank you. And thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.